Sky News All Star Piers Morgan sat down with renowned psychologist and author Dr Jordan B. Peterson, where he exploded about the toxic woke culture overtaking politics. Jordan Peterson unleashed on the toxic woke culture that has made people in the West selfish and ego-driven.
People are going to have to understand more consciously that the errors that they propagate morally, the acts of willful blindness, pretending that they're doing something other than they are doing, morally grandstanding, outright lying or avoiding the truth. With all this technological power at our hands, the cataclysmic consequences of those moral errors are radically magnified. And I don't see that there's an alternative to that. As we get better at doing good things faster, we simultaneously get better at doing bad things faster and at a wider scale. And I concluded decades ago, and this is partly why I stayed as a psychologist rather than, say, pursuing a political career, is that we've always known in the West that the weight of the world rests on our individual shoulders, right? The central story of the West is that each person is to take up their cross and carry it uphill, and that that's a divine calling, and that the fate of the world in some sense depends on that. And we're going to see, Pierce, in the next 30 years, we're going to see, and it might be a lot faster than that, just exactly how true that is, as the evidence for the world disrupting consequences of our hypothetically trivial errors start to become increasingly manifest, increasingly and rapidly manifest. Lay out the underlying archetypal structure of reality, the endless battle between good and evil. And the most profound commentators on such battle have always concluded that the fundamental line is drawn in the human soul. And if you want to get the demons of the world under control, you better start with the demons in your own skull. And if you don't think that's enough to keep you busy, that just means you haven't looked inside with enough, courage and perspicacity. There's plenty of disorder in your own soul to occupy yourself with for the rest of your life. And this is something, we're either going to learn this voluntarily, consciously, and wisely, or we're going to be beat to death by our own stupidity. And that's going to happen quickly in many, many ways. You can see it unfolding. Well, you can see it unfolding around us now.
Dr. Peterson also said that Donald Trump could win the 2024 election if he's permitted to run.
Well, I think he can win, assuming that he'll be put on the ballot. As far as I've been able to tell, and God only knows how reliable the polls are, and generally not very, because the questions are usually biased unconscionably. He's certainly popular enough to win. I don't see another candidate emerging on the Republican side at the moment who poses a threat. There are some interesting people running, that's for sure. It looks to me like DeSantis is a pretty competent character, and Vivek Ramaswamy is, at minimum, very interesting and bright and quite the disruptive force. On the Democrat side, Dean Phillips, who almost no one knows about, and who the Democrats are doing, everything they can to keep it that way. He's an interesting alternative to Biden. I don't think Kennedy has a chance, although there are some things about him I like. I think Trump could win. Will that be good? It depends on what he does if he wins. It depends on the manner in which the victory takes place. It depends on whether or not the people on the more conservative side of the spectrum are able to extend a welcoming hand to those who are more on the progressive side. And it certainly depends on whether those on the progressive side are willing to dispense with some of the ideological stupidity that possesses them, that is generating an endless sequence of unnecessary culture war.
Dr. Peterson then slammed the left for their pathological victim narrative.
The left in particular has become 100% preoccupied with the most pathological possible political narrative, which is essentially a victim-victimizer story, that you can understand every element of social interaction among humans, from marriage upwards to the political, in terms of who's got the power, who's the oppressed. And there's nothing in that but an endless recipe for not only for the most bitter of soul-devouring resentments, but for the application of any form of vengeance imaginable. I can't imagine, this is something that possesses the universities as well, there's nothing more toxic than a victimized narrative. And that certainly possesses the radical left in particular to the nth degree. And there's nothing in that but disaster.
Dr. Peterson also berated the left for spreading false claims about Donald Trump.
Trump is standing against, especially the radicals. He's been put in a position where he more or less de facto has to stand against that kind of smothering, quasi-maternal, devouring sympathy that's part and parcel of being allied with the victims. And so part of that's an ideological problem. I would also say that I believe that there has been no political figure, certainly in my living memory, with the possible exception of Richard Nixon, who's been vilified more thoroughly and also more falsely than Trump. And I would point to the idiot conclusion of Russian collusion, especially with regards to the Hunter Biden laptop, as evidence in that regard. Trump has no shortage of flaws, let's say, a statement that can be said of all of us. But apart from vicious criticism with regard to those faults, there has been an absolute surfeit of devastating criticism and persecution for faults that are not real. And, it isn't obvious to me how much a person can take without starting to feel continually embattled. I've certainly had to fight against the proclivity to cease turning the other cheek, let's say, with regards to those who regard themselves as my enemies. Because if you're gone after enough, you tend to think that the best defense is a good offense, let's say. And it's very difficult to plot your way forward against those kinds of odds. Now, Trump did go into the White House as an outsider, both on the Republican and the Democrat front, and he has faced no shortage of impediments. And it's a hell of a lot to ask of someone to take all that with good graces. And he's certainly done better than he might have in that regard. He's still in the race, for example. Now, you might say, well, if you want to be president, you better be the guy that has that kind of largeness of spirit. And fair enough, but let him who is without sin cast the first stone, let's say.
Right.
He's an old guy, and he's bombastic, and he's under a lot of pressure. And all the lies that have been generated to blacken his name have made him a worse man, at least in his public-facing image, than he might otherwise have been. And I can't help but see in that also a kind of nefarious, underhanded plan. If you can't defeat your opponent fair and square on the field of vision, let's say, or compassion, then you can do everything you can to back them into a corner and provoke them into doing something reprehensible so that you can blacken their name. And it's certainly the case that the Democrats have done absolutely everything they possibly could to do that, say, with regard to January 6th, while simultaneously taking no responsibility whatsoever for the widespread rioting that accompanied, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement.
In relation to the Israel-Hamas war, Dr. Peterson says he doesn't see any hope for peace currently.
With regards to Israel and Hamas, well, a war occurs when people can't agree, and we certainly can't agree on the facts of the matter at hand with regard to the conflict in Israel. My sense is, most fundamentally, that it's been hyper-convenient for the radical Islamists, especially those in Iran, to have Hamas and the Palestinians suffer greatly and continually so that they can be a constant goad in the side of Israel and the US. And so we've stepped right into that as well. What's the solution? Well, I'd be a fool to offer one, wouldn't I? Because there's been a plethora of solutions offered with regards to Israel and the Palestinians over the last 6 decades, and very little progress has been made on that front. And I think the reason for that is that there are incredibly entrenched interests in whose interest it is to prolong and make as bloody as possible this conflict. And so there's no hope for peace under those circumstances. And for the Islamic fundamentalists, so-called Islamic fundamentalists who are fostering the conflict, what's a few 100,000 or million Palestinian lives? You know, doesn't hurt them if all those innocent people die. So that's a dreadful situation. If I was in Israel's shoes, I suppose I would likely do much the same as they are doing, with one possible coda, which is that as Israel becomes more successful on the military front, which is highly likely, the swing in popular opinion is likely to increasingly go against them, because it's a lot easier to trumpet moral virtue by siding with the hypothetical victims than it is to celebrate the accomplishment of the conquerors. And so I'm afraid that one likely outcome for Israel is that they win militarily, but lose strategically.
Jordan Peterson then launched into a passionate tirade against the universities, particularly Harvard.
When I watched it in jaw-dropped amazement. I felt, well, this is the testimony in DC of the 3 university presidents. I thought 2 things. I thought it's a complete bloody miracle that these people who've been clamoring for the restriction of free speech on the basis of oppression and harm can't admit that calls for the genocide of Jews, no matter how arguably tangential, don't violate these incredibly restrictive free speech codes, which they themselves have been screeching about like mad harpies for decades. So that was just a bloody miracle of blind stupidity. And it was a catastrophe, as far as I was concerned, that it characterized particularly MIT and Harvard, because those were great places. And then to ally that with the implicit presumption, as they did, that it was self-evident that the moral stance that those same presidents took would be met with, by the general public, with nothing but open-armed appreciation, was also an indication of how absolutely demented and self-deluding the universities have become. And I say that apart from my financial interest in making Peterson Academy work, let's say, and my moral interest as well. I say that with no satisfaction whatsoever. I worked at Harvard for 6 years and I loved it. It was a great place. And the half-wit Pharisees, scribes, and lawyers have, wormed their way in with their ideological moralizing and devastated those institutions. And people like Bill Ackman, who sort of led the charge along with Christopher Rufo with regard to Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard, they've started to wake up to how deep the rot goes, but they've just barely scraped the surface. So many of our institutions of higher learning, including those devoted to the hypothetically scientific endeavor, have become corrupted to the point where replacement is likely the only possible way forward. Could Harvard find its way once again? Well, maybe if you did what Elon Musk did when he took over Twitter and fired 95% of the administrators and a fair number of the faculty. But who are you going to get to replace them? And who's going to do that? No, parallel institutions are the name of the game now. And you see that with the University of Austin. You see it with Ralston College in Savannah. And that's what we're going to try to do with Peterson Academy. All the quality at 1/20th the price. Hopefully a limited amount of ideological moralizing.